Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. I hope you've heard the great news. Should Have Listened to My Mother has won a 2024 People's Choice Podcast Award for Best Podcast in the Society and Culture category. We were also recognized with 2 additional nominees for Best Female-Hosted Podcast and Best in the Kids and Family category. How amazing is that? And congratulations to all my fellow nominees and winners. And none of this would be possible without your votes and your solid dedication. It's been 5 years of meeting people around the world, and it's just been fabulous. Lucky me. So this week we get to meet someone else who's spectacular. It's an opportunity to meet someone new and learn about insight, life-changing experiences, and their outcome, plus the special someone that played a significant role in my guest becoming who he is today. Alan Lazaros is my guest, and he's learned valuable lessons about the challenges that life can hand us. He's the CEO of Next Level University and co-host of the podcast Next Level University, along with his partner Kevin Palmieri. Alan also is the co-host of the Conscious Couples podcast with Amelia Smith. As a business and life coach, Alan is keen on tracking your habits, which he believes is key to your success. He'll help you stay focused, track your progress, and achieve your best life, which, as many of us know, can be daunting. His philosophy is, we don't have control over what happens to us, but you do have control over what you say, think, do, feel, and achieve. You have to take personal responsibility for how your life turns out, despite the challenges. And I'm pretty certain that we're going to hear of some challenges that Alan has encountered throughout his young life. Alan Lazaros, welcome to Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Gratitude first. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I started listening to podcasts 9 years ago, and they really helped me reorient my life in a much more positive direction. So I'm very honored. I'm very grateful to be here. And I think that anyone or anything that has your attention, to the opening that you mentioned about say, think, do, feel, believe, and achieve, I think that what holds our attention ends up really dictating what choices we make and what we can achieve in this life and where our life ends up. So the fact that I have anyone's attention, I'm very grateful for. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And what is in your mind, what you say and see and feel and think is what takes place. I mean, my mom used to say that all the time, so I believe it. It's what you continue, that mantra in your head perhaps, or the people you hang around with, the kind of work that you have. It forms and shapes you. And this week you're going to share some stories about your mom and the role that she played in your life. Can you tell us how you refer to your mom and or her first name?
Yes, so my mom's first name is Beth. I refer to her as Ma or Mother or Mom. And yeah, my goal going into this episode was just to be as transparent as I can about the good things. I think all of us growing up in reflection when we become adults. So I'm 35 now, I'm going to be 36 in November. And so I've rewatched the movie of my life, so to speak, many times over. I've started doing therapy a lot in my 30s. And I was really thinking to myself, in hindsight, there's a lot of things that my mom did really, really well. And there's a lot of things that I do not agree with at all. And I think that my goal in this episode is just to be as transparent as I can. And yeah.
Absolutely. And how about a little bit of background for Beth, your mom, and her upbringing? Where did she grow up and what kind of a household and siblings and things like that?
Yeah, so she grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. Worcester, for those of you who are not from Worcester, you would probably pronounce it Worcester. And she grew up, she was the third child. She had 2 sisters. One was my Aunt Kathy, the other one was my Aunt Sandy. And my grandmother and grandfather. So my grandfather passed away when he was 89. My grandmother passed away when she was 94. So they have both since passed. But essentially, my mom was the very, 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 very late child. In other words, her next closest sibling was 17 years older than her.
That's a big difference.
And so she was basically an aunt when she was 8, I think. And she grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. Yeah.
And what was the environment like in her household? Was she kind of raised as a single child because there was that big age gap? Or were
Yeah,
her older
definitely.
siblings, her mother, and her mother as well? Kathy and
Yeah, so
Cindy.
my grandma and grandpa, her mom and dad were still together. It was kind of like being an only child again, but in some ways it's very clear that they didn't necessarily want another child. I think that my mom was a surprise and not necessarily, again, they loved her and everything, but definitely there was probably an air of, we don't really want to, we're in a new phase in our life now. We kind of did the whole child rearing, child upbringing thing. And so I think in some ways my mom was sort of, I don't want to say left to fend for herself because she was well taken care of, but I would say there was definitely and this is just my experience from reading between the lines of my mom telling me stories. I think my mom was a blonde haired, blue eyed, beautiful young woman. And I think my grandparents kind of figured she'd just get married and be totally fine. And I think that she always kind of regretted that they didn't focus on helping her get more educated. I think they figured, well, she's a beautiful woman. She'll get married. She'll have kids. She'll be fine. And so she always taught me, make sure you get an education, because I think she always regretted that she didn't.
They never nurtured her really in a direction as most parents do. Like you said, they figured she'd be fine, and they were already in a different place, on a kind of in a different planet or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to me, and back then it was so different, so it's hard to figure out, but my grandmother never really went to college to my awareness, and if so, she was not super educated. And I think that maybe my mom was never really encouraged to get really educated because she was a young, beautiful woman, and I think they figured, yeah, she'd be just fine. So she always pushed education pretty heavily for me, and she said, Alan, you can aim high and you'll have choices. That was the best lesson I ever got from my mom. I mean, that's one that I go to over and over and over again. She said, Alan, if you aim high and you get focus on education, you'll have choices. And she always wished that she had more choices.
Where did your mom get that insight from, or awareness?
That's a great question. I actually don't know where she originally got that, but I can tell you exactly what she said to me. I was very young, and my mom always lectured us. And not Emilia, my sister and I, Emilia's my girlfriend now. Emilia and I talk about this often, but my sister and I growing up would always kind of roll our eyes because, oh, not another lecture. And now I realize this is one of my favorite things now, actually, about what my mom did. Instead of just punishing us, she would always lecture us. And I realize now how important that was, because she wanted us to understand why things were the way they were, not just kind of leave it to us to figure it all out on our own, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so she said this to me when I was very young. I imagine around age maybe 7, something like that. She said, Alan, you can be a CEO or you can be a farmer. I'm going to love you either way. But if you're a CEO and you aim high and go for CEO, you can wake up one day and just decide to be a farmer, but it does not work the other way around. And so I don't know where that philosophy originated, but I do know, number one, she was very correct on that. And so I did. I always aimed high. I aimed as high as you can aim in everything. I still do. I am a CEO now. And that advice was the best advice I ever got. And it's nothing against farmers. One time someone reached out and said, hey, farmers work really hard. And some farmers are very wealthy, so it's not like farmers aren't successful or anything. She was just trying to find a way to explain it to a 7-year-old. But ultimately, she said, if you aim high, you'll have choices. And I think there's a lot in between aiming high and then having choices. But I do believe if you aim high, if you have high work ethic, if you have humility, if you have self-belief, if you are educated, and if you have all of those incredible virtuous qualities, you really do have much more choices than if you are lazy, complacent, and just kind of existing.
Or you think the world is going to give you buckets of presents at your feet.
Yeah, handouts, entitlement, right? The entitlement thing, it was never my thing.
How old was she when your mom got married?
So my mom was 32 29 when she got married.
And she went through school. She went to higher education.
So she went to high school, and then she went to secretarial school. I think she got an associate's, a secretarial degree, and she always says that that's around when the time when computers started to get big. So she feels like her secretarial degree was not at optimal timing. And again, I think part of that is truthful, and then the other part is just her making excuses, if I'm honest.
Well, yeah, because she would have been in on the ground of learning all the new technology and everything, helping all those men in high positions figure out how to do stuff. But that's neither here nor there. And your dad died when you were a baby, so your mom was on her own.
So my father passed away when I was 2 years old, and he was 28, and she was 31 at that time, and I was 2.5, almost 3. So I don't know what his philosophy was necessarily. I've heard a lot of stories about my dad. He was definitely a very confident, outgoing, hardworking person. I think in some ways he was kind of reckless. I've had to sort of reanalyze my life from many different lenses, but I've deduced quite a bit. And I think in some ways he was definitely a big, bright light that everyone really liked. And he poured into a lot of people's lives, and he was hardworking and aspirational. But I don't know any of his philosophies. I do think he was a little bit reckless, and I think that bothers me, obviously. But ultimately, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and he was the one who was going out trying to build a career, essentially.
Okay. And they had a solid relationship from what you understand, or?
Yeah, that's very clear. They were very much in love, and it puts a smile on my face for sure, because it's been hard for me to witness my mom over the years still mourning the loss of my dad, because she's never felt that way about anyone since.
Yeah.
And it's very clear that whatever they had was very, very special for sure.
And perhaps that's what's given her a foundation, the love that she did have to keep it together enough to raise you and your sister. I can only hope. But it obviously was pretty amazing relationship, and she hasn't been able to replace that or find someone as fulfilling as your dad.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I would say it would be very hard for her to, I think that's probably part of the reason she's still single. Mm-hmm. And again, I haven't really asked her that, but I would assume that's probably why. It's very clear because there'll always be certain songs that remind her of my dad, and she'll always get vulnerable and she'll cry and say how much she misses him and stuff like that, but in a beautiful way. It's always been really, it's sad. It's definitely sad, and I think that I had to work through a lot of sadness too, because obviously I didn't know my father either, but and then my sister, she was 6, so she knew him really well. I mean, she and my dad were best friends for sure. So that's definitely, honestly, my father passing away at 28 in a car accident suddenly, it was very sudden. That has been extremely difficult for my family, for sure.
Your whole family, your entire life.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But do you have the kind of relationship with your mom that you would be comfortable saying, you know what? I know you love Dad, and I know he loved you, and I'm sure at this point he would encourage you to find happiness with someone else. It will be okay. Would you ever be able to talk to her about that?
Yeah, she is convinced that she doesn't want to be with anyone. I don't know if I buy it, to be honest. She just got a dog. She named it Cujo. It's a cute little dog.
Dogs are good.
I don't know if she hasn't healed from the trauma of that car accident. I don't know if it's because she doesn't want to love again. I don't know if she's too scared. I don't know if she doesn't have the self-worth to want to be with someone. I don't know if she just hasn't found the right person, but she had a relationship with my stepfather. So I had a stepfather from age 3 to 14. And so she had a long-term relationship with my stepfather. So my real last name is actually McCorkle. Mm-hmm. My stepfather's last name is Lazaros. So I'm the only blonde-haired, blue-eyed Lazarus. I can promise you that. It's a very Greek last name, and I don't have a hair on me.
Biblical, so, in fact.
Greek people always look at me and they go, Lazarus? And I'm an Irish, German, Polish, Scottish, very German. But ultimately, my real last name is McCorkle, and John McCorkle, my dad, it was a big Irish Catholic family. It was Jim, Joe, John, Jane, Joan, Jeanette, and 6 kids. He was one of 6, and I took my stepfather's last name, I think around age 7 or 8, by choice. We were sort of becoming the Lazaroses, and then my stepdad left when I was 14. So she has had relationships since, but that was the only one that I know of.
What is it that kept her going? Obviously, you and your sister, but she had to put on a pretty face quite a bit for many years, losing 2 men in her life, right?
Yeah. So raising 2 kids by herself, I think, it's one of those interesting things where my mom was had to be very strong to raise us. And I've been talking a lot about the genius of the and. Instead of but, it's and. And I think certain things disappoint me for sure. And I get a lot of strength and resilience. There's a big difference between being resilient and then being improvement oriented. And so one of the things that I'm really grateful for about my mom is that she always taught me to aim high. You'll have choices. She taught me to care about school. She actually let me take 8th grade off so that if I promised her I'd get straight A's in high school. And she's the one who encouraged me to go to WPI. It's one of the best engineering colleges in the world. Even though it's extremely expensive, it was $50,000, and that was way back then per year. But one of the things that I think I'm authentically coming to, and it takes courage to say this, she taught me things that she didn't lead by example in. And I think that bothers me more than anything. In my head, you taught me to aim high, you taught me to believe in myself, you taught me all these lessons, you taught me that I'll have choices, you taught me to focus on my education, you taught me to go for it. But yet you didn't personally do any of that. And so that's become very clear to me in my older age is most people are just talk and not walk.
Can you give us some examples?
Growing up, so I grew up in a small town, semi-small-minded town, and I think most of the people I associated with back then, so the way that so at 26 years old, I got in my own car accident. And my father passed away in a car accident when he was 28, as I mentioned. So for me, that was the pivotal existential quarter-life crisis where I faced mortality and realized everything I thought I knew about myself and the world and my family and others, all the trauma. I really turned my life around after that. Before that, I was very successful. I was very professionally developed. I was very achievement-oriented. I was very improvement-oriented, but I wasn't self-improvement-oriented. I wasn't into personal development. I wasn't into personal growth. I wasn't as focused on the inside out. I was focused on the outside in, and I didn't realize it. And so from 26 to 36, I'm going to be 36 in November, I've invested the last 10 years, time, effort, and money into my own self-improvement. And I think that's the piece that was always missing. So to give an example, I grew up in an environment that there was no self-improvement. I mean, most people talked about get a good job and make sure you make good money and all that kind of stuff, but nobody really led by example, in my opinion. As a matter of fact, when I look back, I'm fairly disappointed in a lot of the guidance that was given to me from the mouths of people that didn't necessarily do that stuff themselves.
But it's interesting because it's because of that you have this gift, that you found this yourself, which is the most significant for you and going forward in your future. And now look at what you're doing. So had your mom and all your relatives been there with the positive affirmations and the actions that were synchronous with the words, then perhaps you would have just brushed that off and said, yeah, whatever. But
that's
you
very possible.
Found it on your own.
I think it's a duality. I hold the duality that I wouldn't be who and where I am now if it wasn't for all that. And it's a duality of it's still very hard for me to realize in hindsight how many words there were that weren't matched with actions. And so I actually wrote this in my journal earlier. I literally wrote, leading by example is a 10 out of 10 core value for me. When I'm not on point, I can't expect anyone else to be. And that is something that I've come to in my 30s, where I just care about that more than anything else. If you're not going to lead by example, I don't even want to hear it. And I think there's a lot of people who talk way more than they actually walk. And that's got to be the biggest mistake, the biggest... that's my least favorite thing, I would say. Yeah, people who talk more than they walk.
Actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely.
5-6 years ago when I started this show, many of my guests would say to me in reference to their mom, she did the best she could with what she had. And that was hard for me to swallow for a while. And just maybe moms, in this case, they don't know how. They don't know the next step, how to do that.
She definitely did the best she could with what she had. And the one thing I want to end with, if you don't mind, is there's a big difference between doing the best you can with what you have and then bettering your best. I think everyone does their best. I think very few people better their best, right? And so that's what I'm focused on, is how do I better my best? Because anyone can do their best, but who actually reflects and has the humility to go back to the drawing board and say, you know what? Yeah, I got to improve this. I got to improve that. I got to improve this. And so we would all want to believe that we're doing all we can with all we have, but the truth is we're not. And we have to be more resourceful, and we have to improve, and we need to learn how to be better, because ultimately that's how you raise the bar and raise the standard. And that's how generation after generation is supposed to benefit. So I will do a better job than my mom did. And, but that's because of my mom. And so that's the paradox. That's the evolution of human consciousness. And I just hope that this episode helps inspire people to want to better their best, because I think it's easy to rest on, well, I did my best. Well, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and let's figure out how to do a better job next time, right? So because I lost my father when I was young, and because I grew up in an environment with a lot of people who I don't think led by example, I'm going to make sure that I take the good that I learned and then also improve the stuff that really wasn't so positive.
Mm-hmm. And some people, maybe your mom, need someone to hold their hand to get started. They're just not able to make that shift.
Well, I think it takes a lot of humility to admit that you need help. And so I think that that's the place to start for sure.
Good nugget right there, Alan. Thank you so much. Alan is the co-host of the podcast Next Level University. I was also able to speak with your partner, your co-host, Kevin Palmieri, and he was a true joy. And we will be back next week with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother.